Good afternoon. My name's Fiona Miller. Welcome back. I have the very tough gig of 4 o'clock on a Friday afternoon. So I was thinking of delivering my talk through the medium of song and dance, just to keep you awake and alert. But to save you from that, I will deliver my usual presentation. I have made some changes based on this morning's presentation, and I've shifted the case study right up front so we can get into the grounded issues right up front. Okay, so this afternoon I'll be talking to the topic of disasters, displacement and climate change. What responses will reduce the risk? And as we know, disasters already contribute to widespread displacement around the world, overwhelming the capacity of communities, governments and humanitarian agencies to meet the immediate and long-term welfare, shelter and livelihood needs of those displaced. Climate change is likely to lead to increased displacement, placing a particular burden on some of the poorest countries around the world. Whilst much of this displacement will take the form of migration, planned resettlement is now actively being pursued as part of disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation activities. Yet experience with resettlement in the humanitarian sector and in the development context has demonstrated the high risk of impoverishment associated with this kind of radical intervention into people's lives. Forced resettlement, despite improvements in impact assessment, safeguards and compensation mechanisms, tends to create new risk landscapes for those who are resettled. Essentially because community bonds, connections to place and livelihoods cannot be easily restored once disturbed. So considering the poor outcomes of those displaced by disasters and development, the spectre of large-scale displacement due to climate change presents a quite formidable humanitarian challenge. Yet increasingly in the sphere of climate change adaptation, disaster risk recovery and disaster risk reduction, we are confronted with policies and decisions that directly lead to and justify displacement, particularly resettlement. So how can the risks of impoverishment be avoided in such situations? Can climate and economic, social and cultural risks be dealt with simultaneously in resettlement planning? What principles and practical tools can guide the negotiation of such ethically fraught situations? So this session is based on some new emerging research that I've been undertaking, and I hope to make a contribution to answering some of those questions. But first, I want to start with a case study. So as I was discussing earlier this morning with reference to the Mekong Delta in Vietnam, we have a country in Southeast Asia that's well recognised as being highly exposed, highly vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. And I introduced some of the characteristics of the country that have contributed to this high level of exposure to climate change impacts. So the long coastline, the fact that there are 2 major deltas, considerable floodplains, many rivers, and at the intersection of typhoon and major monsoon patterns. We also have very high population densities throughout Vietnam. It's recognised by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change as being a hotspot for displacement. So it's recognised that there will be high levels of displacement in this country due to the impacts of climate change, especially sea level rise. But as I also mentioned this morning, that we need to be cautious in just extrapolating from climate risk to impacts. And we need to consider capacity within that understanding of climate change vulnerability. And we've seen in Vietnam over the years a very high level of political awareness to the problem of climate change and a level of responsiveness to deal with this challenge. And also some considerable success in recent years in addressing poverty reduction. But what we've also seen emerge within Vietnam's adaptation strategy is a very strong focus on infrastructural solutions, technical solutions such as coastal engineering structures, and within the emerging adaptation response is a consideration of resettlement. So looking at relocating communities from highly vulnerable areas. And resettlement is already part of the disaster risk reduction policy within the country. So I now want to turn to the Mekong Delta, which I was talking about this morning. But this morning I was talking about a problem the Delta confronts in the dry season, and that was water scarcity and saltwater intrusion and the threat of sea level rise. So now I wanted to go upstream a little bit to the upper delta, where in the wet season, communities are confronted with a different kind of risk, and that is the risk of flooding. So this part of Vietnam regularly is affected by severe floods. And these floods can last for 2 to 4 months, sometimes longer. And in these parts of the delta, the floodwaters can rise more than 1 metre, sometimes 2 metres. And there was a situation in the past where people would live with the floodwaters in their homes until, and it was always very interesting for me when I was talking to farmers, they'd always talk about this level. So once the floodwaters got higher than this level in their homes, they would have to consider moving. And I thought, well, why this level? And that was the level at which people's beds started to have water coming onto the level of the bed. But before that, people would still be in the house. But once that happened, it's like, okay, we have to move. So obviously, this caused problems for people, but the floods are also considered an advantage for farmers because they bring silt, they bring fish, they nourish the fields, they enable the high level of agricultural productivity from this part of Vietnam. So the floods are considered a friend and a foe. And many of the adaptation strategies of farmers in this part of Vietnam were about trying to get a balanced approach to this risk. Nonetheless, over recent years, we've seen a rise in the economic impacts associated with floods, particularly impacts on infrastructure and housing, although agricultural losses were fairly stable, and a rise in the number of deaths, particularly amongst children. And obviously, having floodwaters around for several weeks, sometimes months each year, would cause considerable social disruption to the way people live their lives, and people would have to move to higher ground during the severe and long-lasting floods. So, in response to this risk, the national government had a scheme called Living with the Floods scheme, a resettlement program that was introduced from 2001 onwards, which aimed to resettle up to 1 million people from the deeply flooded part of the Delta, so more than 200,000 households. And just to put this in context, this was an area in Vietnam that government encouraged people to settle in in the late 70s, early 80s. But as the flood risk increased and more people started to be affected by flood risks, the government introduced this program to target some of the poorest people who were living in these severely affected areas. So the motivation for the program was to reduce the impacts of floods on those, particularly recent settlers in the deeply flooded zone, and to prevent migration during the flood season, because people had to seasonally migrate out of the flooded area because there was no work at that time. So how the scheme was introduced was through a loan-based scheme. So households were given a loan by the government, which was used to rebuild the house on higher ground along the flood protection dikes or in cluster settlement areas. And the government invested in water, sanitation, electricity and road schemes. So this is quite a considerable scale program when you think about it, 1 million people over this period of time. So what happened? We saw an improvement in school attendance amongst children. We saw improvement in access to services and housing quality. However, there were problems with finances in terms of whether money was entirely used for the purpose it was intended. There were problems with housing quality and the quality of the foundations of the houses. And importantly, there were really big problems with the loan-based scheme. Because what happened, moving people from near where their fields were, so people were living near their rice fields, and moving them far away to higher ground, meant that it was much harder for those people to pursue their livelihood. And so people faced income difficulties because they weren't able to continue their livelihood as easily as in the past. So people fell into debt and weren't able to repay the loan. There were also problems in terms of social networks being disrupted. So whilst the motivation for this plan was to reduce the risk of flood for those who were most vulnerable to that risk, what in fact emerged for many people was that new vulnerabilities emerged, particularly around maintaining livelihoods, maintaining social cohesion within communities and so on. And an unfortunate consequence of the scheme is that as people have fallen into debt, they've had to migrate away to the city to pursue their livelihood. So this is a complicated intervention that has set in train unfortunate economic and social consequences for those who were resettled. And I begin this afternoon's presentation with this case study to highlight some of the complexities associated with schemes that are motivated around reducing vulnerability to the risk of climate change. So, how big a risk is the risk of climate change, and what are some of the current patterns around disasters and disaster impacts around the world? Now, I'm just going to hit you here with a lot of graphs. Okay, are you ready? Okay, a lot of data, but I think it's helpful to see these trends in context. So those who are coming from the Humanitarian Response Institute, you'll be familiar with some of these patterns, but for those in the Climate Change Impacts Group, perhaps you're not as familiar with these patterns. So these graphs are from the International Disaster Base, which is maintained by the Catholic University in Brussels. It's one of the authoritative sources on disaster impacts. So this first graph shows, and I'm presenting this data so you get a sense of the context, some of the patterns, and why we're likely to see an increase in displacement associated with disasters, and particularly climate-related disasters. So firstly, we can get some comfort from this graph. This is showing that deaths due to disasters is declining. We can see from this graph, however, that the number of people who are affected by disasters is increasing. This graph shows that the economic impacts of disasters is increasing. Okay? This graph reveals the highly uneven nature of the impacts of disasters between so-called developed and developing countries. Here we can see that the impacts of the first column shows that the number of people who are affected by disasters in developing countries is up to 98% of all those affected between 2000 and 2004. We can see that similar figure proportion is apparent in terms of those who lost their lives. So it's very highly uneven in terms of the distribution of impacts between so-called developed and developing countries. Now, this is a graph that's particularly concerning from our perspective of those who are interested in climate change. Here is data that looks at climate-related disasters between 1980 and 2011. And what we can see is a clear increase in the pattern regarding floods and storms, and the occurrence of floods and storms around the world. And this shows an increase in the losses, and particularly uninsured losses associated with weather and climate-related disasters around the world. And the final one, I promise, this is the final. Are you taking all this in? It's a lot of data, but generally I want you to pay attention to the trends, because these are important for us to put this issue in context. And this shows the uneven geographical distribution between regions in the world in terms of climate-related disasters. And we can see that in terms of number of disasters between 2000 and 2008, that many of these were experienced in Asia and also the Americas. So again, highly uneven in terms of the impacts. So just to summarise the trends we see in relation to disasters around the world: declining but still high numbers of lives lost, increasing number of people affected, increasing economic costs associated with disasters, highly uneven distribution between developing, so-called developing and developed countries, and between regions around the world, and an increase in climate-related disasters. So that's a lot to take in, and there's a lot of very complicated reasons why we can see these trends emerging. And we need to consider what drives the increased vulnerability of people to these disasters. And to begin to answer that question, we need to consider disasters within our overall development context. That development itself creates the conditions that lead to certain people and places being more exposed and sensitive to disasters than others. And we can see this in terms of how a cyclone of similar magnitude experienced in Bangladesh can have considerable more impacts in terms of loss of life compared with a cyclone experienced here in America. We can also see how inequitable development patterns significantly exacerbate disaster impacts. And I think one of the more shocking statistics I've heard this year is that 62 people own the equivalent of half the world's wealth. And that was a figure that came out of Oxfam report from January 2016. So we live in a highly unequal world. And whilst only 11% of those people who are exposed to droughts, earthquakes, floods and windstorms live in so-called low development countries, they account for more than 53% of those who lose their lives. So we can see a really disproportionate burden of impact of disasters around the world. Development as a process can either ameliorate or exacerbate disaster impacts. We know that. The way urban expansion occurs, whether that's with clear building codes that ensure the quality of buildings, whether urban planning allows urban expansion to occur in appropriate areas and so on. And we can also see that disasters themselves can wipe out development gains and divert essential investments. So I think there's a real danger in seeing so-called natural disasters as purely natural phenomena, as explaining them as acts of God or variations in the weather. We need to understand that the conditions that create vulnerability to disasters are the result of development processes. So, and that's an optimistic story. Once we know that the conditions associated with vulnerability are associated with the development decisions we make, we can begin to pursue different kinds of development that reduce that vulnerability to disasters. And some of the issues that keep coming up as contributing to increased vulnerability to disasters are captured here in this slide. So it's about the unsustainability of development in terms of undermining the resilience of ecological systems, the concentration of people and assets in harm's way, inequality, denial of human rights, particularly rights to self-determination, and global inequalities and unfair trade. So it's really unfortunate for me to complicate the picture by bringing these issues in, right? We'd like to have disasters as something that's very technical that we can manage with a few interventions or better engineering. But unfortunately, that's not the story. Disasters are the product of these wider processes, so we need to consider these in our responses. So one of the problems to date is that a lot of the responses to disasters have been undertaken separately from responses to climate change. And we see that, for example, the climate change adaptation community of practitioners and policymakers is often quite separate from the community of practitioners, experts and policymakers who are working in the disaster field. And again, those who work in humanitarian relief and emergency settings are often disconnected from those other two communities. So this leads in some situations to post-disaster reconstruction occurring without being fully aware of future climate change risks, which may replicate vulnerabilities of communities. And often there are opportunities, particularly in post-disaster reconstruction settings, to take in consideration of climate change, and we have to look for those kind of opportunities. But there are some positive things happening. We've seen at a global scale much more interest in bringing more coordinated approaches between policy and practitioner communities are working across these areas of humanitarian relief, disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation. And I think what is often common across these communities is a concern with vulnerability. And when we consider that these processes are related to development, then we need to consider the everyday chronic risks that people are confronted with and bring those into our responses to so-called extreme or episodic risks. So, I've set the context up for you now to talk a bit more about displacement. What we see occurring now is an increased concern around displacement, particularly due to climate change. But I just wanted to clarify some terms here. For many of us, we've already discussed migration in our work in the Climate Change Institute yesterday, but I just wanted to make a distinction between migration and displacement. And because the distinction is really about the extent to which individuals have agency and control over that process. And so we see that migration, whether that's permanent or whether that's seasonal, is a choice quite often that people make of their own accord, or as a household, people choose to migrate. So there may be significant factors that push people to make that decision, but it's nonetheless a choice people make fairly freely, right? So we can appreciate that that's really an issue of mobility, of migration. Displacement refers to those movements that are much more a situation where people are forced to move. And that can happen in cases of planned migration, where people are supported to move somewhere, not necessarily choosing to. Forced evictions, which happen because of land grabbing schemes, such as palm oil and so on. We can see evacuations are another example of displacement, often temporary. So evacuations can happen before a cyclone happens or before a flood, during or after an event. So often this is quite temporary, and there's a lot of work being done on how evacuations can occur in a way that's more supportive of communities, and particularly vulnerable people within communities. And then finally, the area of forced resettlement, also known as relocation or planned retreat in the context of climate change. And a lot of the work in this space has been concerned particularly with migration, so how climate change feeds into migration patterns. But for me, I'm particularly interested in this area of forced resettlement, so that's what I'll be talking about. But that's also connected with migration, as I explained in the example that I began with from Vietnam. So are you with me? Okay, I just want to keep checking in on you because it is 4:30 Friday afternoon. So what are the kind of processes related to climate change that are going to drive displacement? The first one is the direct impacts of climate change. So these are related to particular disasters, rapid onset environmental changes, but also slow onset environmental changes like sea level rise. The other driver of climate-related displacement, and here it can include some forms of migration, include the health impacts or food insecurity. So these are related to wider climate change processes. And the other is responses to climate change. So all of us would already be familiar with projects in our own country justified, maybe not wholly, but partly as a response to climate change that is leading to displacement. So dams, for example. Dams are now back on the development agenda, clean, green energy. So they lead to considerable displacement. Adaptation projects like building coastal defences to protect coastlines from sea level rise and so on. So displacement can come from many different sources. And what is the scale of displacement? I won't spend too much on this, but there are widely differing estimates of the scale of environmental related displacement, including climate change. And some of these figures are highly problematic. Many of them lack empirical basis. They're based on a simple estimate that this level sea level rise will result in these people being displaced. And we can't necessarily make a direct connection there, because there are things that people can do to stay in place. So there's different adaptations people can do and so on. So you need to take these figures with a grain of salt. The figures around disaster-related displacement are a bit more rigorous, and we can really have some more confidence in these figures. And a good source for a lot of this data is the Internal Displacement Monitoring Centre in Norway, that is compiling data on the number of people displaced by disasters. And this figure again shows the extent that weather-related disasters lead to displacement. And so we can see that the numbers are fairly considerable just for the period 2008-2013, 165 million people displaced. So, but what's not captured in this data is for how long people are displaced, whether they're able to return, under what conditions they're able to return, and so on. So there's a lot of questions we need to ask related to this issue. We also have greater certainty as to where displacement will occur. And again, the sites of displacement really reflect the injustice associated with climate change that I referred to this morning, the double inequity of climate change. That those countries who have least contributed to the problem, who have the least capacity to deal with it, are the ones who are most vulnerable to these kind of displacements. And note, this map doesn't really capture the Pacific. Like a lot of maps, the Pacific just falls off the map. But we know that the Pacific Islands are particularly vulnerable to displacement. We know South and Southeast Asia, because of the high number of floodplains and deltas and high population density in those areas, are also highly vulnerable to displacement. So we can anticipate where this problem is likely to occur and start to think about how this issue can be dealt with in a more humanitarian, more egalitarian way. So, some of the ways people are responding, as I mentioned, is in the form of migration. So we know that this is generally more voluntary. The environment is rarely the sole factor that drives migration. It's often a very complicated story that people have as to why they migrate. And we also know, despite the xenophobia associated with this issue of climate-related refugees and so on, that most of the displacement will occur in countries. People will largely migrate within their own countries. And we know that migration is often a way people cope with stress. But it can also reveal that adaptation in a particular place is not working. So people have to migrate. Resettlement is different because it often is not voluntary. So there's a big distinction there with migration. It's ostensibly seen as permanent, but when resettlement schemes fail, people move on. They might try to move back to the previous risky place, or they might move on to somewhere else. But we also know from the example I discussed earlier on that resettlement as an intervention generates new risks for for people, particularly around establishing their livelihoods in an unfamiliar place. So that's a huge challenge, particularly with climate change. So it's a dynamic process. These issues are connected. So resettlement can happen from one risky place to a place that's considered less risky. But you can have out-migration occurring long before resettlement happens. You can also have return migration, and you can have migration from resettlement places to other areas. So even though I've tried to neatly separate these two activities, these two forms of mobility or displacement, they're often quite connected. And that has implications for policy, it has implications for different humanitarian and development organisations who want to engage with this issue and think about how to support people to adapt to climate change. Displacement is now being considered as a form of adaptation. So migration, displacement and resettlement have only recently formally been recognised as part of adaptation. And we saw that at the COP16 in 2010, that the UN, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, invited all parties to undertake, and you can read it yourself, measures to enhance understanding, coordination and cooperation with regard to climate change-induced displacement, migration and planned relocation. So it's been on the agenda, at least officially, since 2010. At the recent COP, unfortunately, there was the rejection of the idea of setting up a climate change displacement coordination facility that would better deal with this issue and look at how climate-related finance can be channeled into this facility to act as some way of compensating people for displacement due to climate change. So that would connect with an idea of climate justice, wouldn't it? That people could be compensated through this facility because of displacement. Did it happen? No. Australia voted against it, as did other countries, and instead this issue has been parked in a task force, unfortunately. So the issue, these are not new issues. So the problems associated with displacement have been well recognised within the development sector for many years. Because as we know, development as a process has contributed to widespread displacement. So in your own countries, reflecting on your own country settings, what projects are you aware of where people have been resettled by the state? Do you see them listed here? So we can see that geopolitical concerns about establishing territorial dominion, that has led to resettlement. We've seen resettlement justified in terms of population redistribution. We see it related very much to infrastructure and dams in particular. So just to get the figure, because I don't have it in my head, so it's estimated about 200 million people have been resettled due to development projects, with up to 80 million of these people resettled due to dam construction alone. So people have been resettled and displaced because of development for a long time. And there's a wealth of knowledge and experience with this issue within the development sector. So climate change is just another issue, that's another driver of displacement that we now need to consider. We also see that in the humanitarian sector, in the disaster context, there's also been very mixed success with relocating communities after a disaster. And following the Indian Ocean tsunami, there was a lot of discussion about resettlement and relocating people further away from the shoreline so as to reduce their risk to future tsunamis and climate change. But generally, what occurs in the sector is that people are very resistant to this idea. People would prefer to deal with the potential of an episodic, potentially disastrous risk of another tsunami happening, rather than deal with the challenge of re-establishing a livelihood in an unfamiliar place without established social networks around them. So, very mixed experience. And there's been a lot of work done looking at the specific impoverishment risks associated with resettlement, and they're listed here. I really love this photo. Do you know what this is called? This is called a nail house. So we see, and The Guardian did a whole series on this, and these are pictures, well, these are houses of people who have resisted being resettled. They refused to take the compensation offered to them. Eventually this house was knocked down, but you can see that people really resist this idea of resettlement for many, many reasons, particularly because of people's attachment to place, to the connections they have established with communities, to the familiarity of eking out a livelihood in a particular place, and so on. Or because the compensation is just too little, it's just too unfair. So you can see this list, it's a long list. So this, again, underlines the complexity of resettlement as a strategy to reduce risk for people, that reduce climate risk for people. So who decides when people need to be relocated because of climate risk? Does climate risk outweigh these considerable other threats that communities face once they've been resettled? So, just in the final remaining minutes, I just wanted to go over some of the factors that contribute to impoverishment from resettlement and some of the efforts that are being pursued to reduce these risks for resettled people. And so there's been a lot of research done in this space, particularly in development context, looking at development-induced displacement. And the first issue that I wanted to highlight is that there's been a lot of concern in the literature about the over-reliance on financial compensation as the primary way to offset the impacts of resettlement. Consider some of the communities that are resettled are not fully integrated into market economies. So financial compensation is unlikely to fully capture the value of their houses and associated resources. Often the compensation is inadequate. There's also lots of problems around corruption. Non-transferability of livelihood, knowledge and skills, that's something that we've already touched upon. There are also political factors that undermine the success of resettlement schemes. So lack of participation of those who are directly affected by resettlement. And we'll come back to that. Corruption, and I think the point that I really want to underline is the lack of incentive and the political will of those government officials who are charged with managing resettlement projects. So there's often no incentive for those officials to do a good job. And it's a highly complicated area. So it's very challenging for those officials involved, often at the local government level, to do resettlement according to the laws and the standards that are set. There's also environmental issues, and this is a particular challenge when we consider that people are already living in some of the on the best quality land, right? So what land is left? It's quite often land of a lower quality. People confront issues of the reduced complexity of the ecological and natural resources there, and so on. And I wanted to also highlight the social and cultural dimensions of resettlement, because this is one area that's been quite poorly addressed in assessment practices and resettlement in the past. We've seen quite often a neglect of the role of community institutions and the importance of social networks. So as we know, in disaster contexts, one of the things that comes up again and again is that when people are initially offered temporary shelter and then temporary housing and then eventually resettled, at each stage, their social networks, their community connections can be disrupted and severed. So that can create real problems for people to cope with resettlement. And loss of connection to place and cultural identity associated with place is something that's particularly confronting in the Pacific and in the Arctic, where large-scale resettlement is now occurring due to climate change. So, don't be overwhelmed by the complexity of this issue. I've broken it down in this way to highlight that at each point there is an opportunity to intervene and improve practice. We have a wealth of experience in this field where we can actually anticipate these problems emerging in the resettlement process, and each of these issues offer an opportunity to improve practice from the past. So the efforts around improving practice have focused particularly on improving the guiding principles for resettlement, and I list here many of the quite influential principles and guidelines, some which are more related to development, some much more related to disasters and humanitarian situations, and some that are much more related to refugee situations and climate change refugees in particular. So there's a lot of work that's been going on in gaining some agreement on guiding principles around resettlement. And what keeps some of the common features within these guidelines are the importance of respecting humanitarian law, some of the international conventions that exist around the rights of those who are displaced, the importance of having communities drive, if not drive the decision-making process, at the bare minimum being involved in that process through participation in decision-making. And another important principle is just not restoring people's livelihoods to what they were before, but improving them. So there are three of the key common principles I see emerging across these broad areas of development, disasters, and climate change. And the other key area where there's been a lot of effort focused to improve the outcomes of those resettled is around assessment, particularly impact assessment associated with resettlement schemes. And Taya Scudder has written a lot about how impact assessment can be improved. And these are some of the principles or ideas he's identified as being significant to improving assessment practice. And you can see some of these wider principles I just mentioned are echoed in the way assessment can be conducted. So the importance of a participatory process, starting early with assessment before rumours, uncertainty and concerns start to set in within the communities. Having an iterative process, so having assessment done prior to, during and after resettlement takes place in order to respond to emerging risks that come up for those who are resettled. And importantly, not just focusing on financial compensation and economic aspects of people's livelihoods, as important as they are, but to also consider social and cultural dimensions of people's lives. And importantly, a recognition of the importance of human rights and human dignity in this process. So we have some guidelines, we have clear principles, and we have tools at our disposal that can improve the outcomes of resettlement. And we know with climate change, due to the pattern of climate change and its interaction with disasters, that we are likely to be confronted with increased displacement and planned resettlement. But we're not starting from scratch. There's a wealth of experience associated with forced resettlement from the development and disaster context that we can draw upon in ways that can hopefully avoid some of these risks of impoverishment and maladaptation that we've seen documented before. So we need to be aware that reducing people's exposure to climate-related risks can generate new vulnerabilities for people, particularly associated with re-establishing their livelihoods in unfamiliar places. So that goes to the heart of the issue here as to whose risk counts, whose risk perception dominates this process, and whose knowledge around risks determines the decision whether to resettle, when to resettle, and how to resettle. So these are the important questions that need to be kept in mind when we confront this issue of climate-related resettlement. And there's been some very innovative approaches taken to this issue, and what we see emerging is the importance of community-led decision-making, that households aren't picked off and negotiated with to get the lowest compensation arrangements and so on, but communities work together to drive the process in a way that can keep their social networks in place, in a way that can ensure cultural practices are respected and maintained in new localities, and in a way that can contribute to livelihood enhancement. So I'll leave it there. Sorry to rush through. Thank you for staying with me on this Friday afternoon. So thank you. I can take one question. No, actually, I can take more questions. I was just joking. Yeah.
Mine is not really a question, but it's a comment related to one of the projects that I sort of participated in one of the communities where like diamonds were discovered.
Right.
Then initially it was sort of an open access before the government sort of controlled the mining and introduced new mining technologies and companies. So the people were relocated. So we were doing sort of a project to understand how that relocation impacted on the people, their livelihoods and other things. And some of the people were also highlighting like the issues of inadequate compensation, but there were some other very interesting sort of symbolic reasons that they also highlighted, like for instance the issues of the sacredness of some of the places where they do their rituals, as well as the graves of their relatives, you know, leaving them to a new place. So we found some of those reasons very, very interesting. Those religious, symbolic reasons why they were resisting relocation in that particular community.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. And obviously there are no easy solutions around those particular issues, and we've seen particularly around dam construction, the inundation of sacred sites, of cultural heritage, of graveyards and so on, have caused enormous cultural traumatic impacts for people. And in some cases there's schemes to relocate graves, which is traumatic in itself, but there are also now efforts to look at how to maintain those connections to those sites through other ways, through festivals or through rituals that may not occur in place, but in the new locality, so that some connection is maintained. Yeah. Yeah. Yes.
In terms of the immigration, I was just wondering if
sounds like, sorry?
Displacement and resettlement sounds like permanent.
Yeah, sounds like, sorry?
It's permanently moved from people from one place to another place. In some areas, when actually either the drought or flood happens, it's seasonal. So whether it's a seasonal migration or it's more like a permanent migration. Because my appearance in Vietnam 2009, actually I experienced a very huge flood, which is around in the last 50 years the biggest one. So the whole Hanoi was flooded. And then, because I had studied on this kind of disaster at that moment, and then that also raises another question: the migration between, or the, how to say this, resolution for the rural areas and the city might be quite different. So I'm not quite sure for your study whether this can show that's different, and also if you move the farmers from one place to another place, and then that's not only just resettlement, because they need the land and they need to start everything.
Absolutely, so it's complicated, and I think we know that people migrate. When people migrate, they often rely on their own social networks or commercial operators who assist them with migration. So they have information that helps them with that choice to some respect, and they are able to go and come back. It is something that people do seasonally as a way of coping, okay? And we can see that, and it has different implications as well. Seasonal migration can generate money for remittances for families back home, as can permanent migration. But in the case of resettlement, it's a different kind of process, I think, and people have less agency associated with that process, with the initial decision to relocate. And I think that's the issue of concern for me, because once you start to threaten people's agency, it has implications for their human rights and human dignity. So we need to be sensitive to that issue in particular, because resettlement can have very grave consequences. Yeah. So.
One last question, and then yeah.
When you were saying about, we were talking about the impoverishment risk, living in the development, you were saying something about the lack of financial transparency.
Yeah.
You were saying, or talking about the lack of financial, if you are able to explain that.
Yeah. So the issue of financial transparency, so that was just a nice way to say corruption. So we know with resettlement that when there's money involved, particularly financial compensation, that a lot of that can go missing, particularly on a scale of 1 million people, 200,000 households. So there has been a fair bit of work done to look at how compensation can be done in a more transparent way so that it can not be delivered in a lump sum, because when you deliver it in a lump sum, people tend to use it for consumption rather than investment in production. So there's all kind of issues associated with the money associated with, with the money associated with compensation. So, and particularly, I highlighted the issue before around local government officials. We often know that in government, that's the level of government where people quite often are demoralised, they don't have good salaries, there's all kinds of problems that lead to issues around their competency to manage a program as complicated as resettlement, and particularly to deal with some of the sensitive social and cultural issues, the conflicts that can emerge with host communities and so on. So I think support at that level is particularly important to build the capacity of local government officials who are involved in resettlement, so that issues around corruption or favouring certain households more than others, those issues can be dealt with better.
I think I'll encourage the conversation to continue after. If you'd like to come back down and talk to Fiona, I encourage you to do so. It's past 5. We've finished our official program for today. So have a great weekend. Thank you for a fabulous first week of BIARI.
Thank you,
everyone.